Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm Brenda Talent, CEO of the Show Me Institute. For those who don't know about us, the Show Me Institute is an independent research and education organization. We focus on Missouri fiscal and economic issues from a free market lens. One of our challenges, though, is how do we effectively convey the impact and connection of our policies that we're recommending to the lives of Missourians? That's why I'm really excited about the guests that we have today, because we're going to discuss how storytelling connects policy with people. So let me get some housekeeping out of the way. We will be taking questions. To ask a question, look at the bottom of your Zoom screen. There's going to be a Q&A box. Click on that and type your question. Zach Lawhorn of Show Me Opportunity is going to be moderating those questions for us. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Lee Habeeb is CEO and founder of American Private Radio and host of Our American Stories. Lee got his start in radio co-creating the Laura Ingraham Show, which launched in 2001. By 2007, it was the #1 show in America in its time slot. He moved to Salem Media Group, where he now serves as VP of Content, overseeing shows hosted by some of conservatism's greats, Bill Bennett, Dennis Prager, and Hugh Hewitt, to name just a few. Lee also writes a weekly column at Newsweek. With Our American Stories, Lee provides a unique radio program that profiles American heroes and icons from history, industry, entertainment, sports, and culture. Each hour, the show showcases inspiring stories about people and events that have made a positive impact in American life. No politics, no opinions, just stories. But of course, these stories do tie to important values that make America exceptional. And that is what our program is about today. How do we connect? How do we reach people's hearts and minds? So with that, I'm going to turn the program over to Lee. Thank you for joining us, Lee.
Thank you. And thanks for the kind words, Brenda, and Zach, thanks for the help, and appreciate everyone joining on what I think is a very important aspect and dimension of conservatism that I think we've neglected for a very long time. And I'm going to have a PowerPoint that accompanies this because there are some interesting audio clips and pictures that I think will make the points that I'm about to run through more salient. So just if you can give me a second, I'm going to pop this up and go to slideshow. And we can start. So in the end, storytelling is the world's oldest killer application. The words "once upon a time," once you start there, you own the attention of the audience. And in the end, what we're up against with Facebook, with Google, with streaming, and all these other medium, and including our political speakers who are messengers themselves, is that attention. And if we don't get people's attention, how do we teach them about what we care about? To start any talk on storytelling, it's best to start with Plato. Those who tell the stories, he said, rule society. The biggest selling book of all time, one that's been a blockbuster for as long as people have been reading books, is the Bible. Christian or not, we all know the stories. Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, the prodigal son. That's what's so powerful about the Bible. Believers, non-believers across the globe have been stepping into these stories, and they've been seeing themselves in them. The world is made up of stories, not atoms, the poet Muriel Rukeyser once said. Why do stories move people? It's a question I've been grappling with my whole life. It's simple. Human beings are hardwired to absorb the narrative form. Stories have structure, characters, plots, themes, and emotion, all of which reflect life. Indeed, storytelling, as I had said earlier, is the world's oldest killer app because stories change hearts and they change minds. Indeed, one good story changes everything. In the world of public policy and politics, story really matters. And it matters because people relate more to stories than to data and remember stories long after the facts have been forgotten. About 2 years ago, I was commissioned by Mr. Bernie Marcus to attend a Frank Luntz dial testing on minimum wage. It was about 50 Democrats and 50 Republicans, and they were both holding dials in their hand. And through this time, different arguments were being made by different think tanks. Different wordsmithing was being done by Mr. Luntz, and I went last. And all I did was summarize a story that had been told on our show by a young lady who is now a middle-aged lady. And I was taking the story that she told me from young lady to middle-aged lady and about her life at Wendy's and how free enterprise had changed her life. Moreover, why minimum wage hikes would be a bad idea. And I made this argument through story, and I'd like to play it now because you're going to watch what happens when, rather than debate the idea of the minimum wage, which, by the way, Frank Luntz told Mr. Marcus, Frank Luntz had told Mr. Marcus, this is just a loser for us. And we didn't believe that. So this is what we ended up doing. By the way, I tried to get the woman to come to this, but she was too busy. So it's me in a black t-shirt trying to look like the common guy telling Dawn LaFrida's story.
A lady named Dawn LaFrida. Dawn was 17 years old, she told me, and she was working at a Wendy's and her dad left home. So she had to drop out of school and she had to put in more hours at that Wendy's. Pretty soon she was putting in 60 hours and 70 hours, and the manager liked her so much that she made her manager. And he ended up being an owner. She rose from manager to co-owner of another Wendy's. Today, she owns more Wendy's than any other person in the Wendy's franchise. Dawn tells the story about how many other young people she likes to give an entry-level job, to train to have another job, and to learn the most important skill there is in life, to show up, to grow, to clean, to learn personal responsibility, and to move on and learn the skills that they need to even stay at Wendy's and one day even own a Wendy's. That's the argument that she gave for saying no to a raise the minimum wage.
So that sort of shows the power of story. And by the way, a president who truly understood the power of story and ushered in a conservative revolution was Ronald Reagan. It was my first vote as a kid. Millions of young people like me, Laura and Dinesh, we were college kids at the time. We all voted for the old guy too, as he was called by the media, because his stories hit home. His stories about freedom, about free enterprise, they moved us. They connected with us. And they connected really to the map of the human heart. A friend of mine recently sent me this video clip from President Reagan's farewell speech to the nation. These were his final words, and they were as important then as they are now. I'm going to play you the last minute of his final communication with all of us.
We've got to do a better job of getting across that America is freedom. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare. It's fragile. It needs production. So we've got to teach history based not on what's in fashion, but what's important. Why the Pilgrims came here, who Jimmy Doolittle was, and what those 30 seconds over Tokyo meant. You know, 4 years ago, on the 40th anniversary of D-Day, I read a letter from a young woman writing to her late father, who had fought on Omaha Beach. Her name was Lisa Zanata Hen, and she said, "We will always remember. We will never forget what the boys of Normandy did." Well, let's help her keep her word. If we forget what we did, we won't know who we are. I'm warning of an eradication of the American memory that could result ultimately in an erosion of the American spirit.
Imagine those words. If we forget what we did, we'll forget who we are. It's one of the great lines that Reagan ever delivered, as good as tear down this wall. George Orwell understood what Reagan was talking about. He said this about the importance of a story as it relates to nations. Battles for the future are always about the past. No country, by the way, better understands this than China. Back in 2004, author Louisa Lin visited 4 Beijing universities. What would happen, he wondered, when he showed students a photo of Tank Man? Would they recognize it? You know the iconic picture, one lone man, 2 shopping bags in hand, standing courageously in front of a line of tanks in defiance of the crackdown by the Chinese government at Tiananmen Square in 1989. It turned out that only 15% of the Beijing students recognized that picture, and it wasn't an accident. As Lim explained in his book, The People's Republic of Amnesia, and by the way, that's the picture. It wasn't an accident. In this book, The People's Republic of Amnesia, Tiananmen Revisited, the Chinese authorities were determined to blot out the public memory of the protests. In America, we have a different problem. Too many of us now know the most shameful aspects of our history, and there are some, while erasing from public memory our most positive stories. It's China in reverse, and a very different kind of amnesia is setting in. Several years ago, a team of storytellers got together just outside the city of Memphis. We're in Oxford, Mississippi right now, to launch a nonprofit daily 2-hour-a-day syndicated storytelling show. We had the help of Mr. Phil Anschutz, Bernie Marcus, the Federalist Society, Leonard Leo, and Hillsdale College. I think we had all known what was going on in this country in terms of memory. And the show was to do one thing: celebrate America, celebrate free enterprise, rule of law, property rights, the Constitution, by telling stories about these things, about the events and the people who made this country what it is today. The show had a simple, and still has a simple and important mission: tell the story of America to Americans. America's the star of the show. The American people are the star, and the supporting cast is free enterprise. From the arts to sports and business to history, as Deborah had pointed out, those are the stories we tell. We started with one affiliate 5 years ago. We have 315 and growing, and are now the fastest growing show in the country, and we're on 2 hours a night. And I believe we're succeeding precisely because we're telling good and beautiful stories about a good and beautiful country. Not a perfect country populated by perfect people, but a good and beautiful country populated by good and beautiful people. So I wanted to share just a couple of good and great stories with you today to give you an idea of how we think about story, and then how you might think about story as it relates to the public policy battles you're trying to effectuate and win in your state. Some of these stories you know, some you don't, but note the level of detail. Too often as conservatives, we just use the characters in the story to make our point. But if we do a good job of story, the story makes the point for the listener. We don't have to tie the knots. We don't have to hit them over the head. The story has that kind of power if properly engineered. So here's the first. It's the story of a city of fire and a rebirth. Experts disagree on how the fire started. Some say it was a cow. Others say it was vandals. But everyone agrees as to why the fire started. It was Chicago's epic growth. In 1840, the city had 4,500 residents. 10 years later, it had 30,000. And that number grew to 100,000 by 1860. By 1870, that was 300,000. What led to that growth? As the saying goes, location, location, location. Chicago was near the center of the country, near where the waterways and railways met. It was the perfect place for anything and anyone to get anywhere. Timing also played a part. America was going through a transformation from a rural to an industrial power. But how did all that growth, all that life, lead to a near-death experience? Chicago had to build quickly, so they built it out of wood, explains city historian Samuel Morrison. It was quick, it was easy, and it was cheap. Mother Nature played her part too. It was an exceedingly dry and long summer and fall, said meteorologist Tom Skilling. Months without rain had parched the city. Worse still, winter was approaching, and those wood houses were filled with firewood, timbling. The Chicago fire, it turns out, wasn't predictable, it was inevitable. It started on the west side and quickly roared out of control, a steady wind propelling the inferno from block to block and across the Chicago River. Not sure what happened there. Oh, sorry about that. And across the Chicago River. 30 hours later, the fire finally ran out of fuel. There was nothing left to burn. The fire claimed nearly 300 lives, a third of the city lay in ruins, and 100,000 people were homeless. Most of the hotel, stores, and banks were destroyed. Here is a picture of State and Madison not long after the fire. What happened next, though, is the story, or as Paul Harvey liked to say, the rest of the story that revealed the character of the city and the nation it inhabited. There was no FEMA back in 1871, no one to blame, no one to sue, and no appetite for victimhood. Even before the bricks stopped smoldering, the city's leaders were planning a comeback. We haven't lost our geography, Reverend Robert Collier told a large congregation that gathered outdoors. Nature called the lakes, forests, and prairies together in convention long before we were born, he said, and they decided that on this spot, a great city would be rebuilt. Within 48 hours, 12 of the 29 banks that had burned down were operating in makeshift facilities to get money to customers. Bankers got busy raising capital. One sent letters to bankers all over the globe, urging them to invest in the people of his city. They'd get a great return, he promised them. Chicago was rebuilt in unimaginable pace. By 1880, its population reached 500,000. By 1890, it passed the 1 million mark, becoming the second biggest city in America. Here is a picture of that same intersection a mere 20 years later. The people of Chicago rebuilt their great city without the help of the state or federal government. American optimism, resilience, character, and capitalism itself rebuilt the city. Love rebuilt the city. That's just one. I'm going to tell you another quick story about Dolly Parton. We told this about 6 months ago. Dolly Parton grew up in the Smoky Mountains. She had a good family. They didn't have much, but she had this hunger and this talent and a daddy who taught her a lot about business, negotiation, and the idea of owning what you do. And Dolly Parton made her way to Nashville, got on to the Porter Wagoner show, and there she started to sing songs on this big national television show. Well, pretty soon the audience was falling in love with Dolly. Dolly was writing some very good songs. She had a prodigious writing talent. Dolly was also smart. She kept the intellectual property. She owned her songs. They weren't Porter's, they were hers. Towards the end of her contract, Porter wanted to renew. Dolly wanted to fly. She wanted to leave and test out her own chops, see what she could do. Porter felt betrayed. Dolly felt, well, boxed in. So on the final night of her contract, she wrote a song for Porter. And the song was called I Will Always Love You. And it was not a song about romantic love, because she and Porter did not have that kind of relationship. But she was telling him in her own way, I love you, but I have to go. She sang this. Everyone on the set cried. It became a hit for her. And about 20 years later, 15 to 20 years later, Colonel Tom Parker comes to Dolly and lets Dolly know that Elvis would like to record the song. And Dolly's thrilled. And Tom Parker says, well, look, we'll get on up to Nashville. Elvis will come up. We'll bring up some musicians. And they do. And on the day before the recording, Dolly meets Tom Parker, and Tom Parker gives him a one-page contract. And he lets her know that when the king sings songs, the king gets to own the song because he's adding value. To which Dolly said, these are my songs. They're not his. I'm not signing. Now, can you imagine the courage this takes to tell Colonel Tom Parker and the king of rock and roll to sort of stick it where the sun don't shine in a very polite and nice way? Well, Elvis never recorded the song, but about a decade later, Whitney Houston did. That became the biggest selling song in pop music of the decade and made Dolly a nifty $50 million. And at the end of telling that story, we always point out that it was the founding fathers, and Ben Franklin in particular, who protected not just patents, which is in Article 1, but ideas, because he was a writer and he owned this thing called Poor Richard's Almanac. And he didn't want people stealing his intellectual property. So the founders were modern thinkers in this way. And their thinking applied to this poor girl from the Smoky Mountains. By the way, Whitney Houston and Dolly get connected by this song. And think about the power and beauty of free enterprise. Whitney Houston grows up in Newark, New Jersey, African-American daughter of a gospel singer. And Dolly Parton's this Smoky Mountain white girl who had no money. And they come together through the miracle of free enterprise because of this song, because of free market capitalism, and because of this thing called the music business. And it's a business. And because of that, this song was actually, as Dolly told us, sung in a way I could have never sung it. She said when she heard Whitney Houston sing the song, it was where God wanted the song to be, with truly the greatest singer in the world. A beautiful story about a lot of things, about the miracle of free enterprise, but most importantly, about our founders and this idea that we own our ideas, that they're ours. Next story, a little history story. I've got two more. This is a story about Ben Franklin, because, well, we love to connect stories in our American stories, and we do it a lot. We go from the old to the new. And he was one of our founding fathers and who worked hard to protect the ideas through something called a patent, because he was, as I said earlier, an inventor, a writer, and a publisher. Franklin understood the power of ideas, but more importantly, understood the value of ideas. This story, though, reflects a deep division within our not yet formed country, a division that split not just fellow countrymen, but family too. And the consequences for choosing a side in the biggest political divide of the 1770s wasn't a mere Twitter storm or getting canceled. An awful silence pervaded the House as we were called up one after another to the table of the President of Congress, Benjamin Rush said, to sign what was believed by many at the time to be our own death warrant. Rush was right. The British government considered the Declaration of Independence a treasonous document. A treason, by the way, was a capital crime. How divided was America at the time? One look at Benjamin Franklin's family tells the story. The printer, inventor, writer, and diplomat was a driving force of the American Enlightenment, but his own home was torn apart by America's first Civil War. Franklin's son, William, was illegitimate and had all the advantages of any boy of his day could imagine. Throughout their lives, the father and son were extremely close. Franklin even used his influence to secure his son the royal governorship of New Jersey. Neither man could have imagined they'd one day be forced to choose between king and country. The father joined the cause of the Patriots. He urged his son to join him. William instead sided with the Loyalist. That choice led to his immediate arrest and a 2-year stint in the Litchfield Gaol in Connecticut. Quote, it was a destination of last resort for outlaws, the condemned, the convicted murderers, reprobates, and traitors of this world to be hanged, wrote Daniel Epstein. After his release from prison, William immediately emigrated to England, never to return to America. A few years before his death, Franklin received a letter from his son, who was hoping at a chance at reconciliation. The father wrote back promptly with these chilling words, quote, nothing has hurt me so much and affected me with such keen sensation as to find myself deserted in my old age by my only son. And not only deserted, but to find him taking up arms against me and my countrymen in a cause wherein my good fortune, fame, and life were at stake. The two men would never reconcile. Franklin died a wealthy man. He left his son nothing. The political divide today is still about power and a distant city, but that distant city isn't London. It's Washington, D.C. It's a fight we've been having since our founding. Fights about power, fights about sovereignty. Next story. And this is another beautiful story about not just America, but intellectual property. We love to use art stories to tell the story of our founders. This next story is about an unlikely author of America's songbook. Few write as many songs, fewer still write as many standards, and fewer still write songs that become a part of our national identity. White Christmas and God Bless America, both of which this one man wrote, are part of our cultural DNA. Berlin did it without formal training. He couldn't read or write music and played almost entirely in the key of F sharp because it was easier for his untrained fingers to play the elevated, well-spaced black keys. Irving Berlin's story is about many things: hard work, adversity, creativity, and really it's about America itself. He was born Israel Berlin in Russia in 1888, one of 8 children and the son to a cantor in a local synagogue. His family fled Russia after their village was destroyed in an anti-Semitic pogrom. Berlin's only memory was of his father lying on a blanket by the side of the road, crying as he watched his house burn to the ground. His family settled in New York, but there was more tragedy to come for young Irving, none worse than the loss of his father at the age of 8. It was at a job waiting tables in his early teens to support his family that he discovered a hidden talent. His tips skyrocketed when he hummed the songs of the day. Singing at tables soon turned into songwriting. He wanted to create his own version of American classical music, one that appealed to the vast population of his adopted nation. And he did just that, writing over 1,500 songs. He told his biographer that he, quote, didn't believe in inspiration, and that his most successful compositions were the result of hard work and grit. One of his early successes started as a failure. Berlin wrote God Bless America in 1918 while serving in the army, but he couldn't find a buyer. In 1938, as Hitler was rising to power, Berlin pulled that old chestnut out of his drawer. Kate Smith recorded it, and the rest was history. Berlin's daughter wrote that her father meant every word of the song. She said, quote, "It was the land he loved. It was home sweet home. He, the immigrant, had made good, and he was saying thank you to the country he loved." Writing one anthem would have been enough for any mere mortal. But in 1941, Berlin wrote another, White Christmas, which would go on to sell 50 million copies for Bing Crosby and become the best-selling single of all time and one of the world's most beloved Christmas songs. These two anthems may be the most compelling aspect of Berlin's legacy. A Jew wrote White Christmas, and a Russian wrote God Bless America, and he was the same guy. Only in America is such a thing possible. Only in America is Irving Berlin's life possible. He died at the age of 101, a wealthy man in large part because he owned his own publishing company. America's artists, Berlin included, owe a debt of gratitude to our nation's founders, who secured not just property rights, but intellectual property too, and the freedom to write about anything without recourse from the government. It's why American artists are the most prolific in the world, because they're the freest. And they live in a place where their ideas are protected too, by our nation's founders in the Constitution and in Article 1 itself. And this is the last, and it's just a great free enterprise story. And it's about a lady named Marcia Taylor. And it's the unlikely story of a single mom who became a trucking industry matriarch. She was born in 1944 in Bluefield, Illinois, a small town of 500. Her youth wasn't much different than the other kids across the country who grew up in such places. Quote, "My mother always had a big garden, lots of chickens, and I helped her when I could," recalled Marcia. "My dad always had a lot of wheat, soybeans, and corn, so I'd always help him in the fields. It was a great way to grow up." But all in Taylor's idyllic small town life was about to change. Quote, "When I was 14, my father got sick, and he just got up one day in front of me and passed out. And right there and then, he died. He left my mother, my little brother Dwayne, and I with a farm. It was devastating. I ended up being the responsible one for the family." Taylor plunged headfirst into adulthood, getting married at the age of 16. By 19, she was the mother of 3 children. "My aunt told me to call the last one the caboose and let it be the end," Marcia laughed. The marriage, it turns out, wasn't a laughing matter. It produced children, but no love and no nurturing. "Neither of us," she told us, "were really ready to be married, not ready for the responsibility of having 3 children. My husband started to drink. It became an abusive relationship physically and mentally, and I knew I had to get out." Not one to wallow in misery, Taylor did something about her circumstances. Some friends in her neighborhood owned a stake in a small trucking company in Georgia, and there was a job. Taylor jumped at the opportunity, seeing it for what it was, a chance to start anew. "I knew nothing about trucking," she said, "but I knew it would be a way for me to get my kids and me to move to a new location. We loaded everything up in a truck and a 40-foot van, and all of our belongings took up a mere 10 feet. We moved to Georgia, moved into a mobile home, and I was able to finally file for that divorce." She arrived in Georgia as a single working mom with children in the 4th, 5th, and 6th grades, but she wasn't alone. "My mother hadn't been in the best of health, so I called her and she came down, and thank God she helped me raise my kids." Taylor would go on to marry the man she worked for, and together they worked hard. In 1974, they made a business bet that would change their lives. "We had the opportunity to buy this little trucking company," she said. "They had 15 trucks, 30 trailers. We only had $500, but they sold it to us on credit." It wasn't easy making payroll for the first few years, but the couple managed to get the trucking company on solid financial ground. But Taylor's life, already filled with tragedy, was about to have the biggest tragedy. Her husband, JD, had been a heavy smoker, and he decided to give a new advertised treatment a chance. So he went to this smoking clinic, Marcia told us, that was attached to one of the large hospitals. The operation, she said, didn't go as planned. And after a brief return home, she knew something had gone very wrong. She rushed her husband to the emergency room. He never came back. Taylor was once again a single mom. "So all at once," she told us, "I was left with this business." And this was back in the 80s, and there really weren't any women in the transportation business, certainly nobody running a trucking company. "I was really worried the bank would recall our line of credit because they wouldn't trust a woman. and I had 3 small children that I had to take care of, and also my mom. But I just put all my faith in God, she said, that whatever was supposed to happen, well, he'd see me through. Her faith in God was complemented by her faith in her employees, and theirs and hers. It turns out, she said, my drivers all gathered around. There were 30 people who worked here at the time, and everybody just said, we can do this. We went to work. Her work and the company's success came at a cost. She worked 60 and 70-hour weeks for many years to become the largest female-owned trucking company in the nation, with nearly $500 million in annual revenue. I feel guilty that I didn't spend more time with my children growing up. I wish I could go back and change that, Marcia said. I feel like I missed a lot. Now, thank God, I've gotten to work with my children, so I'm very fortunate in that way. The family business now consists of 14 different companies that do all kinds of transportation. They have 3,200 drivers and owner-operators in nearly 400 different offices in and outside the United States. But what truly set apart Taylor's business from the industry pack was the culture she created at her company. The CEO and matriarch of Bennett International Group did things differently than her male competitors, creating an environment that nurtured her employees. Her driver retention rates are the envy of the entire trucking industry. What Taylor was clearly most proud of was how her company managed its workforce through tough times, especially the 1980s recession. She wanted more than anything to avoid staff cuts, born out of practical business sense, her experience as a single mom, and her deep Christian faith. Rather than do the customary industry layoffs and workforce reduction, she reduced ancillary expenses, diligently watched cash flow, and asked everyone in the company to take small haircuts and make small sacrifices. Quote, I've always believed that if you treat people right and give customers a great service, the profits will follow. The Taylor happened to be a woman and a single mom, had a lot to do, she told us, with her executive decision-making. Her choices made her company better and stronger, and as the economy rebounded, they were poised to make more market share. At the young age of 75, Taylor doesn't have any immediate plans to retire. Quote, I firmly believe that you should get up every day and work to make a difference. I feel like I can do that here. And much of Taylor's satisfaction is found in the family atmosphere she's managed to create and the foundation she and her workers have established. Quote, we started a foundation based on Christian values where we give back 10% of our corporate earnings each year. One of the things we love to do is run a camp in Old Town, Florida, where we take a week and sponsor children and grandchildren from all around the country to have a free camp time. What makes Taylor's business different than others, it turns out, comes from her life experience, from her faith and the worldview it engenders. Quote, we try to make use of this company to help show Christian love. I definitely think that this is a ministry. It allows us to reach people we might not have been able to reach otherwise. Taylor's story embodies the best of America's virtues and qualities, and those of free enterprise too. Grit, resilience, hard work, cooperation, faith, generosity, and love. And that is our final story. That's all, folks, as we like to say in our business. And I'd love to take questions. I was just giving you an idea of how we tell stories. And let's make sure we're really telling the story of these people, including that part. She said, I want you to make sure you tell everybody that there was a cost to my success, that I had to be away from my kids. And my kids have come to understand that. But it was really rough for me, and it was rough for them. We often leave that stuff out, and that doesn't make our stories real. And then people don't connect because it feels like propaganda. So I'll leave it with that, Brenda, and turn it back to you and to Zach for questions.
All right, well, thank you, Lee. That was great, great stories. I want to remind everyone watching that you can submit your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we do want this to be interactive, so please do that. Lee, I wanted to start with, you mentioned that at the founding of the country, that Americans were greatly divided, and you see weekly headlines that America is now more divided than ever. A lot of people mention, Civil War. Let's shorten the time frame. As someone who reads, writes, and talks about history, let's look at the last century. Do you buy the argument that this is the most divided America has been in the last 100 years?
No, not close. I think my dad reminds me, I wasn't quite old enough, but he was a superintendent of schools, had served during Korea, and is essentially a self-taught history PhD. family field trips to Vicksburg from New Jersey, Lewis and Clark Trail. This was his life. Reading David McCullough, reading Stephen Ambrose. And he said, just remember what happened around the Vietnam era. That there was a generation of kids, and it wasn't a few activists on campus. It wasn't people from the top and adults pushing it on the kids. It was the kids themselves from the ground up reacting sort of violently to the generation and everything the country stood for before it, spitting on soldiers. My dad told me stories of how ROTC kids at the high school couldn't wear uniforms. They would get spit on in high school in New Jersey. And it was all over the country because, when he left the military, many of his friends went into education. And let's remember what the stakes were then. We had Watergate. We had, and this is as it relates to Republicans, we had something far worse than unemployment. We had 16% interest rates. How do you get a mortgage? I was going into college in 1980. And boy, everyone was depressed. And Carter basically had told everybody our worst days are behind us, turn down your thermostat. So I actually think that period was worse. And look, there were epic fights during the Great Depression, real divisions, political, about and in the 30s, about what Roosevelt was trying to do to reshape the country. I mean, you want to talk about some redistribution of wealth. Look at what happened in the 1930s. There were a lot of people who fought hard against all of the programs of Roosevelt. So look, there are some elements of this that make it harder because of Facebook. It's gotten more ugly and we see it. We didn't see it before. Now we see the Facebook posts. We see the cancel culture. It's in our face. So I think that dimension is different. And I think that is changing how we all feel about all of this stuff. But remember, all the way back to the revolution and on, the countries had fierce division. Larry Arnn likes to remind me in the Revolutionary War that 1/3 were for the war, 1/3 were against it, and 1/3 were hiding under their tables, hoping it would go away.
When you decide to tell a story, how do you decide what's going to be the most effective medium to use between video, podcasting, terrestrial radio, written publication?
Well, right now, I'm focused on getting the audio from either real life people who were alive. So whether it's World War II survivors or Rosa Parks, I want to get her voice. I want to get the audio from the Rosa Parks Museum. I want to get the audio that, if I can, from the Henry Ford Museum. If I want to get the Henry Ford story, I want it to come from the Ford family, the Ford Museum. I want to get the voices because there's something about a voice that's really powerful. There's something about just hearing something and then forming the word pictures that's very powerful. It's also very cheap to do. And we're doing terrestrial radio and podcasts and streaming right now. But we're about to start doing video versions of these things too. It just costs a lot more to make the video or make the movie than it does to simply send a recording pack out to Marcia Taylor. We sent her a really good recorder. We wrote down about 9 or 10 prompts. We told her to talk as long as she wanted. We were listening on the other side, asking a question here or there. We had 3 hours of audio. We whittled it down to 35 minutes. It's been one of our most requested stories at Our American Stories, because you can just imagine there are a lot of women and men who've had similar circumstances, who were in similar circumstances, and they want that hopeful message that there's something beyond the death of your husband. There's something beyond the tragedy. And it's not the false hope being peddled by the left. It's the real life hope peddled by us if we would bother to peddle it. And I don't mean peddle it in a diminishing way. I'm Lebanese. We're peddlers. Jews were peddlers. We sell stuff. And I think this has been the great blind spot of conservatism. We've invested a lot in politics, a lot in think tanks, and we love our think tanks. But we got to learn how to convert our thinking. And this is, I think, the premise of this talk. How do we convert the thinking to the power of story so we can affect change? And again, it goes back to, why would I vote for Ronald Reagan? Why did an 18-year-old kid vote for Ronald Reagan? And I know why all of us voted. And he got 54% of our vote in 1984. It's because he was selling his policies through story continually. He even used a story to talk about what was happening to story. He even tells stories about stories with stories. So I think this is something I think we all recognize. And the question is, as you saw with the minimum wage, we set that dial to 92% with conservatives and 83% with Republicans and 83% with Democrats on something that had never polled over 50% in an entire day of of testing, because we had come in before that with facts and data. So we were making the arguments about, well, unemployment, if we raise the minimum wage, we'll give 860,000 people work, but we'll lose 200,000. And so once you start accumulating numbers that big, people don't relate. But give that one story that, by the way, has metaphoric power. We can't just make that story be an anecdote. That story has to be more than an anecdote. It has to have what I call metaphoric power. It has to translate into such an overwhelmingly common sense idea, the way Milton Friedman did with his I-Pencil story, that you almost can't refute it with a counter story, let alone with facts and data. It just makes sense. So that's where I would, that's how we choose. In the end, we choose our stories based on what we think will get ratings, because I want ratings. And so we're constantly trying to figure out what is the public like? And sometimes we pick stories and they don't like them, and we get rid of them or we fix them. And if they like them, we give them more stories like that. And what they've liked is the mix of stories, the old and the new, sports, then entertainment, then the entertainment business, and then just a free enterprise story, and then a story about George Washington, which I had no idea that the story of George Washington surrendering his commission, which we did a 30-minute deep dive on, was Washington deciding with no thought to simply say, I know I just want a war, but I'm going home. King George III said, if that's true, Washington's the greatest man that ever lived. By the way, once I tell that story to young people in a college, which I love to do, and I also let them know that with a search bar on their Google, to ask them how many countries had slavery when George Washington was alive, right? Because I try to teach them that you shouldn't judge people out of context. And what's so fun about being with students is they're curious. So I ask them that question, and they're stunned to find out that only Great Britain and Belgium had outlawed slavery at the time. The rest of the world, slavery was normal. So I'm always trying to do two things in storytelling. First, advance the country, but also advance this idea of context. That once people know the context of the story, it changes everything. Like the kids are like, I didn't know every country had slavery. Well, there you go. Now maybe you're going to see Washington as a great man who happened to own slaves, rather than a man who owned slaves and that's it. And therefore, let's cancel him.
So you mentioned Reagan, you mentioned Milton Friedman. What is your working theory on why the monopoly of storytelling has fallen so clearly on one side of the ideological spectrum?
Oh, I actually have more than a working theory. I've been polling this for a decade. I walk into a large audience and I'm giving a speech. And before I do, I said, I'd like to take a poll. If your son or daughter were to tell you tomorrow that they were going into the Marine Corps or going into the Navy SEALs or go one to our fine military academies, how would you feel? How many of you would be in favor of that? Almost every hand goes up. How many would be against it? Almost no hands go up. Then I say, how many of you would be excited if your kid said they're going to the Tisch School of the Arts in NYU because they want to be a novelist or an artist? Not a hand goes up. And I said, and then I play him a speech by Robert De Niro at the Tisch School of the Arts. I play him a mere 3 minutes. And Robert De Niro's talking to these kids. And they're 22. And I call them kids out of respect. They're young. They've got their whole life. And he jokes. He says, thank goodness you're not lawyers. We got enough of them. He goes, thank goodness, you're not accountants. That'd be a pretty boring life. But, you could have been nurses. You could have been teachers. You could have been business owners. But you know what? You chose this thing called the arts. You're engaged in a cultural fight for the life of this country. Your work is important. It will change how we think about everything. He starts to talk about his first exposure to thinking about economics from an Arthur Miller play, Death of a Salesman. And if you remember in that play, the evil business owner fires Willie Loman without looking at him, and he's playing with a machine while he's doing it. And this is Arthur Miller's way of making the capitalist evil and Marxism, which he peddled all of his life, good. And so basically what De Niro was saying is, this is our Marine Corps. We don't think this way about story, and we don't invest in story in our nonprofits or in our for-profits. By the way, that's about to start. Look, I convinced Phil Anschutz and Bernie Marcus to do this. So they're one of the richest Christians and one of the richest Jews in the country. And they understood it. They saw it. They also understood that when our politicians run for office, when our senators, when Josh Hawley runs for his Senate seat in Missouri, he's got to pay CBS, NBC, Yahoo, Facebook. He's funding their storytellers. This is crazy. We should reverse engineer what they're doing. We're reverse engineering This American Life. It was a very popular NPR show that was out once a week. We said, oh, we can do that once a day. We can do it better than them. And we can tell stories about a good country. They don't like America, This American Life. I don't think really, because they're always talking about ways to fundamentally transform the country. And we sort of think differently about our country. So I think that in large measure, it's been this not anti-arts and story stand, but just, that's just a waste. That's just a silly pursuit with your life. And we wouldn't think this way if one of our kids wanted to be a pastor or a priest or as I said earlier, a member of the Navy SEALs. So I think that's the big one. They believe in this stuff, and we don't.
A two-part question. So what's your opinion on the modern kind of conservative storytelling landscape, and specifically people like Ben Shapiro moving into movies? Dinesh D'Souza has produced a few movies. And the second part of the question, who do you think fills the vacuum that's kind of been left by Rush Limbaugh?
They have two very good questions. I don't think anyone ever fills the vacuum. If you'd ask the Chicago Bulls owners who filled the vacuum after Michael Jordan, there's not an answer, right? Because Rush had this God-given talent that created an industry. So whoever goes in there won't be able to, and shouldn't try to fill the shoes. They should simply try to start their own show, do as well as they can, but I don't know how they're going to get to the audience size that Rush did. I think there'll be a huge drop-off, and it won't be that host's fault. It will be literally like being the next guy who has to take Michael Jordan's shoes. And ultimately, someone may come along, but it's going to be a different kind of show. Because remember, Rush was an innovator. People didn't do that before. He innovated not just in the style of show. He innovated in the way the show got marketed. He did this thing called barter, where he would actually take the show and give it away for free. And all he would ask for back from the local station was 3 minutes of ads. No one had ever taken that kind of gamble before, put up all that capital into content, hoping that there'd be this exchange that would occur where he could build up enough national commercial inventory to then sell it. This was it wasn't just a great show on the content side. Rush innovated how to actually do it. So my gut is that Dan Bongino will give it a run, but there'll be a few other people trying to get that 12 o'clock slot, and it'll get divided by 3 or 4 hosts. There's almost no slot. Look, I have Dennis Prager, I have Larry Elder, I have Eric Metaxas. No one of our shows eats up more than about 20% of their slot. When I was with Laura, we got to 28% of our time slot. Rush was about 80% of his time slot. No one even wanted to compete against Rush, because why bother? So that's what you're going to have happen is Rush's 600 affiliates, some at iHeart, some at Cumulus, some at Entercom, some at Town Square, are going to pick up whoever they think is best. And it might be Charlie Kirk. We signed Charlie Kirk. We have Dinesh D'Souza's podcast at Salem. Who knows who it'll be? I think it's going to be a mixture of a bunch of people, but there's no one's going to get more than a third of that market share. Rush was just that big, that good, and he was that early. He was the first. And there are first mover advantages.
Sure. And thoughts on people like Ben Shapiro, Dinesh D'Souza moving into more of a storytelling arena?
Look, I wish them luck, but I deeply believe that they're not artists. They're proselytizers and they're conservatives. And I spent 8 years in a great acting school, and I learned more about storytelling there than those guys will forget. I'm glad they're trying, and I wish them luck. But in the end, I think the tendency will be to do stuff that's on the nose, so to speak. That is very political and politically charged, so they can sell it. Ben's at the Daily Wire. It's a clearly conservative thing. Look, to succeed in storytelling, we're going to have to tell stories to people who don't agree with us, not just to our own marketing funnels. So in the end, we've got to have people like me who decide to never appear on Fox, to never talk about Donald Trump, to never talk about Obama, and to go into the space and be seen sui generis as a person who just tells stories. That's my life. Because once people look up Ben and they see his opinions, they're gonna. I write at Newsweek, but I never write about politics, ever. I tell stories like these. Last week, it was Madam C.J. Walker, the first Black female millionaire. That's what I do. Ralph Lauren. And it's been very and wildly popular. Now, my conservatism is embedded in there, but when people look me up to find out what my opinions are, they're not going to find any. I don't have any. Well, I do, but I keep them to myself. And I think, by the way, that a lot of these leftists are making a mistake shooting off their mouths all the time because they're losing audience. They're losing a lot of people. My wife will not watch a Robert De Niro movie anymore. And if he had done that when he was younger, he would have lost a lot of fans. The greats like Gary Oldman don't do this nonsense. You don't hear Gary Oldman or Will Smith, or most of these people do not chime in. Mark Wahlberg, they just go and they make movies, right? Keanu Reeves, think of all the big stars that aren't a part of the woke crowd, right? It's a lot of them. They just go and do what they do. So my gut is that these two shall pass, but we really need to get our young people who are artists to make stories, because artists make stories and debaters do politics. Debaters make bad storytellers. They make really bad storytellers. And it doesn't mean they can't be in the movie business, but I really would love to see the kind of quality of storytelling that the other side has. And most of the people I've met who tell stories, and my sister lives in Studio City in Burbank and does a lot of work for a lot of folks in the industry, writing music and scoring stuff with her husband. And most of those people, though they lean left, they're always just looking for a good story. And then their left-wing tendencies just sort of come out in the curation, what this kind of stories they're interested in. But it's not like they're trying to like manipulate things after that. They're attracted to a certain kind of story. We're attracted to a different kind of story. And I think we just got to invest more in truly original talent in both the storytelling space and, more importantly, the story production space, the business side of it. And I think in the next 5 years, with Over the Top and with streaming and the success of podcasts and the success of our show, which I already have a bunch of young people who I think in the next 2 to 3 years are going to say, hey, I want to go and start my own podcast or my own film company. And I'm going to tell them, good, I'll help you get financing. So I think that there's great demand for all American stories. You know, Tony Dolan, who wrote speeches for Ronald Reagan, reminds me regularly. He says, you know, the old man, he was the chief speechwriter for Reagan all 8 years. And he said, you know, the old man used to always tell us, people want to love where they're from. People want to love where they're from. So simple, right? And actually, the reason Reagan did the storytelling about how good America is, because in his mind, people actually vote on these rudimentary things. If you think America's terrible, then you want to vote for the guys who are going to fundamentally transform it. And if you think America's good, you want to vote for the guys who think America's good. And when Trump came out with that Make America Great Again hat, whatever you think about the guy, whatever your feelings, and I was leading prep for debates for one of the other candidates, I told everybody that hat is brilliant and it's going to hurt us. And it's hard to run against that because Reagan did Morning in America. Remember, Reagan used that same kind of metaphoric imagery because he wanted that Democrat vote. He wanted people in the center left to vote for him. My goodness, 44 states and then 49 states. Who would have ever predicted that in 1974 after Watergate, that we'd win 49 states in 1984? And I think, by the way, the country's primed with the right candidate, with the right love message, with the right free enterprise message to do it. I think it's very similar to the 70s, what's happening now. Black Lives Matter, Black Panthers, the progressives, the Chicago 7. This isn't a war. But a lot of the other things feel vaguely familiar.
So one of the things that is different from the 70s is that we live in this time where people can curate all the information that they get. You can choose which podcasts you listen to. You can pick your favorite cable news network. You can pick who you follow or block on Twitter. Everyone's in this information silo. Do you see any way to reverse that?
Yes, and this is, I think, a great question because this is what Dolan really reminded me of. He goes, Lee, if you think it's bad today, think about how bad it was when President Reagan was running and when he was president. Think about it then. There were 3 channels, ABC, NBC, and CBS. There was no Drudge Report. There was no Fox News. There was no talk radio. And trust me, those 3 networks didn't like Reagan. They gave the impression, after watching their seemingly objective news, that he was old, he was senile, he'd blow up the country, and you know the rest. But somehow he managed to connect with people who would not otherwise have been inclined to vote Republican because of story. And this is again, getting back to Ben, or Dinesh, they'll only get so far reaching other people besides their silo. We're reaching people that we cannot believe we're reaching, because we can look, our audience is now 3.2 million Nielsen. So we can study the numbers, and we got people who just simply don't even say they're political because they like our stories. And then the more they listen to our stories and we don't proselytize, the more we have a chance of reaching. And Prager University has done a good job of this. He can count the millions of young people who've bumped into a video and said, good, but that's up to the curator, who better have as its mission, I'm not trying to reach the choir here. I'm trying to grow market share. That was the whole purpose of Our American Stories. We're not selling to the choir. I don't go on Laura Ingraham Show. I love her, but I'm not going on there. They already know. That's why I write for Newsweek and not National Review. If we don't do that work, and it's harder to do that than it is to talk to the choir. It's really easy to talk to the choir, say something outrageous about OAC, and get a large Facebook following. But who cares? Who cares? These are new ways to reach new people. And I think this is the challenge for your think tank. I think it's the challenge for your local and statewide politicians and your donors and your supporters. How do we grow market share? I think this is what any business thinks about every day. And we've got to think about that hard. And this is why I love story. Very subversive. I'll leave you with this because it's so powerful. I'm a Christian. We don't hit it hard, but 65% of Americans say they're Christians. By the way, we also do stories about Judaism and Islam. You know, there are so many great and good Muslims in this country. We welcome them. We welcome our agnostic and atheist friends to the show too, and tell those stories. But our most powerful story that we tell every year, the one everyone wants, I tested on our station in Los Angeles. And I called the woman who ran that station to say, look, tomorrow you're going to hear the words Jesus Christ on your radio station 6 times in about 4 minutes. I'm preparing you for the non-violent reaction to your audience because we were following Dr. Drew. It doesn't get more secular than following Dr. Drew's. And the premise of the 20-minute segment we were doing on Martin Luther King was that tomorrow, folks, you're going to hear about the assassination of Dr. King. Tonight, you're going to hear the story of Reverend King's last sermon in a church. And then we simply had an actor read Martin Luther King's speech, which was about fear and God, and it was about the Good Samaritan. And then he started to quote scripture, and then he left. And then he predicted his own death in this speech. It was a very prophetic speech. He had death rates, the likes of which he had never experienced before. The Mississippi folks told him not to come. The Tennessee State Authority said don't come. The FBI said don't come. But by the way, King had heard this again and again and again. Don't come, it's dangerous. So where did he get the courage to do this? And he talked about that courage coming from this story in the Bible. Why did one Levite get off his donkey and help? And why did 2 go? And who are you? And he goes, and this is why I love the Bible, because it's always asking us hard questions. Who do you want to be? The guy who gets off the donkey or the guy who rides past the person in need? And by the way, I call her the next day. There are 210,000 people listening that night. And by the way, most on the left, not a single complaint about the words Jesus Christ, because who was saying them? It wasn't some Republican on, TBN. It was Martin Luther King. So this is the subversive nature of storytelling. Much of good storytelling has to do with who's the messenger, not what the message is. And that's what we proved to the owners of that station in LA, that we're Christians, but we're not going to scare off your mostly secular market. We promise.
All right, just a couple minutes left here. I want to close by asking you to look ahead. So one of your recent episodes was about the iron lung, and it had all these great old radio clips of celebrating the arrival of the vaccine in 1955. And looking back, there was no mention of great polarization. It was just celebrating this feat of humanity. 50 years from now, what do you think the story of 2020 is?
Oh, I think the story, if we get smart, and I don't know why pharma isn't at this. I'm not a perfect defender of pharma because I've not loved what pharma's done with patents and patent extensions. They've written some patents 30 years. Wish we could fix that. But I've always been a defender of pharma because it takes 9 years to get a drug to market. It costs $1 billion, and not everyone gets to market. So it costs $3, $4, $5 billion to get a drug to market. And why couldn't we do that faster? That's what will bring down drug prices, and it'll increase innovation. Well, think about what, and again, like Trump, don't like Trump, but think about what happened with Operation Warp Speed. I mean, it reminds me of what happened in our story about the B-24 Liberators. I mean, we made 19,200 B-24 Liberators, and we had Stephen Ambrose tell the story. What did that? Henry Ford's arsenal of democracy. These are factories. Without them, we couldn't have won World War II. And without our great pharmaceutical companies, we wouldn't have vaccines to markets in a year. And because we relaxed the time, it didn't increase the danger, not at all. So why are we waiting 9 years again? I think this is going to begin a conversation which says maybe pharma is not so bad. Have you been hearing anybody rip pharma, a single politician for the last 6 months? Not one, right? So this is why I don't understand the industry and all of us. Why aren't we getting out and pushing that narrative so hard, despite all the other stuff that's going on? And yeah, maybe it'll be hard to get traction because Facebook doesn't love the story right away. But an investment in this storyline, I think, would make differences for voters. It would make differences in the consciousness of the ordinary American. Every time I talk to people, I always tell them, hey, what do you think about that vaccine? Man, it's amazing. I said, you know who did it? Who? Oh, those evil pharmaceutical companies did it. Oh, yeah. I mean, and they did it in a year, and they could save hundreds of thousands of lives. Isn't that amazing? Right. And they, that's not a story, though. That's proselytizing. I'd love to be able to tell them the story. Right. Because what a story it is. What a story it is. So I think that all this time later, we're going to have learned that this was a tough disease, that a pharmaceutical, that as has happened with Jonas Salk, an inventor, finally rid us of the iron lung and this worry of every parent in the world that my kid could become paralyzed by this virus. And it was a viral infection. It was a virus. And that's why we love telling the iron lung story. It just teaches us without teaching us. And it seems very, let us just say, similar to what's happening now. And you're right, there wasn't the politicization of polio then as there is the politicization of COVID. But in the end, some of that's on us. I mean, we've got to get better at storytelling and messaging that reaches the other side. And then let's spend some advertising dollars reaching the other side. Let's not just always talk to our side. Because as I've learned from Newsweek, you tell the right story in the right way. I just told the story of North Face. They wouldn't sell their jackets to an energy company. They said, we don't do that. It's like selling to tobacco companies. So the head of that energy company, who had ordered 400 North Face jackets for a Christmas present, he wrote a letter in LinkedIn saying, it's interesting because you guys, your jackets and all of your equipment relies heavily on my product called oil. Your polyurethane, your this. Moreover, the transportation of people to the ski resorts where they ski is reliant upon fossil fuels. In fact, without fossil fuels, there wouldn't have been a ski industry. How did people get to Denver? There was no skiing 100 years ago. Nobody could do it. By the way, that LinkedIn thing went viral. Then the Colorado Gas Association awarded the North Face their Customer of the Year award, thanking them for all the oil they use. This is smart, right? And then they told the story of the amount of oil in so many of the products we use, from dentures to contacts to just about everything, including this screen and this phone and what it's propelled by. So story, more story, and then good messengers. And we win, they lose if we do this.
All right, well, thank you. That was great. I hope everybody enjoyed it as much as I did. And Brenda, I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, I want to thank you, Lee, for a very informative program. You've laid down the challenge for us to figure out how we come up with stories that are going to convey the power of free markets and what they mean to people personally. So thank you. For the people who are still with us, you can download the podcast for Our American Stories on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcast. And you can also visit Our American Stories by Googling it. You can find an affiliate station near you. So if you want to learn more about them, please visit them online, Our American Stories. And of course, to learn more about the Show Me Institute, please visit us at showmeinstitute.org. And we hope to see you at our next event. Looking forward soon, we hope, to actually getting together again in person. So thank you for joining us and stay safe.
Thank you.